let's go ahead and get started. Things are starting to settle in with the attendee rate. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is our final distinguished speaker series of the spring term. So we're so happy to have you here. Today's speaker is Dr. Monica Lopez Gonzalez, who will present the science, ethics, and geopolitics of artificial intelligence. Dr. Lopez Gonzalez is a serial entrepreneur and the co-founder and chief executive officer of Cognitive Insights for Artificial Intelligence. She is widely known for her human-centered and industry-agnostic approaches to tech and business. She's an expert in the science, ethics, and governance of artificial intelligence, and she is on the front line of the AI-enabled autonomous systems, healthcare, biotechnology, cybersecurity, and education industries. She is a Johns Hopkins faculty member in the Whiting School of Engineering's Department of Computer Science with several additional appointments. Her courses sit at the intersection of artificial intelligence, cognitive neuroscience, design, ethics, entrepreneurship, and public policy. Dr. Lopez Gonzalez holds bachelor's degrees in psychology and French, a master's and a PhD in cognitive science, and a graduate certificate in international studies from the Johns Hopkins University. And she recently earned a certificate in artificial intelligence policy from the Center for AI and Digital Policy in Washington, D.C., as well as a certificate from the Venture Capital University Independent Director Initiative at UC Berkeley School of Law. So without further ado, everybody please welcome Dr. Monica Lopez Gonzalez.
All right, well, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, so first and foremost, thank you, EP, for inviting me to speak. And of course, to our audience here, good afternoon, good evening, and perhaps even also good morning. Thank you for joining me and all of us here today. So as you know, I'm going to be speaking about the science, ethics, and geopolitics of artificial intelligence, or AI, as I will call it from now on. Obviously, these areas are separately and combined quite vast and very nuanced. So given the short amount of time that we have together, I'm going to use this moment to take a very high-level view of their intersection. And then, of course, I really look forward to the Q&A afterwards so that we can perhaps even engage in some debate. So it's impossible to not begin our conversation with latest developments. Since entering into public consciousness in November, it was, I believe, last year, news continues essentially unabated now about generative AI from ChatGPT to Bard and all sorts of variations from others that are based on LLMs or large language models. And the list is long, but I just had to highlight some of the statements that have been made on their performance and their impact on society. Statements like, we've now had the major introduction of plagiarism at scale. There's now a whole sort of hodgepodge of truths and falsehoods. There's now the demise of human creativity. It's all about the domination of power players. There's been a call for the ban of its use. There's also been a call for a 6-month moratorium on the development of GPT-4 and greater. And there's also been the claim that AGI, or artificial general intelligence, is actually closer than ever. And last but not least, there certainly has also been the prediction that AI could essentially lead to nuclear level global catastrophe. So being in the AI space myself for over a decade now and witnessing a very niche domain become the technology of the day that allows for unprecedented speed, scale, and contribution to society, it's actually been really fascinating to see the level of interest and also of concern increase with each week, each day now, not only in the past year, but literally over the past several months. And amid the noise, however, I do want to point out that I would argue that the fundamental reality of selective memory and missed opportunity remains. Although I was not alive at the time to see it myself, but apparently we have already experienced a level of awe and distrust with a somewhat human-like chatbot when computer scientist Joseph Weizenbaum from MIT introduced ELIZA in the mid-1960s to students and colleagues. And ELIZA, a limited pattern matcher, really, that ran on scripts, apparently beguiled users with its person-centered Rogerian psychotherapeutic-like capabilities. And I have to note here that Weizenbaum himself would actually write about the phenomenon in his book of 1976, Computer Power and Human Reason. And if you haven't read it, I very much recommend it. And I quote here, he said, "What I had not realized is that extremely short exposures to a relatively simple computer program could induce powerful delusional thinking in quite normal people." Now, I'm highlighting this key example and bringing up this particular quote from history, because even though it was a beginning step in natural language processing and very simple in its conversational capabilities, it did not deter users from apparently attributing the system very human-like qualities and characteristics like background knowledge, with the capacity for insights and reasoning ability. And what's really interesting about that is that those very particular characteristics, Weizenbaum himself made very clear that the system did not possess. Now, if you haven't already tested ELIZA out, I suggest that you do so and actually have a lot of fun with it. And you'll certainly observe how it's nowhere near where we are today. So fast forward 57 years later to today, and although we are obviously very much well armed with greater computer power, with massive amounts of data at our fingertips here, and across really just in terms of being able to have access like never before seen, I would argue that psychologically speaking, we're actually right where we were back then. And that is at an existential crossroads of innovation and over-attribution. Now, in fact, ELIZA was perhaps most importantly, and with uncanny insight and foresight, above all, an experiment in the psychology of human relationships. And of course, by extension, of human-machine relationships. And we're seeing this with ChatGPT-2 right now, where these chatbots are revealing the expectations, the assumptions, the desires, and the passions that we attribute to our interlocutor of machine kind, of course, in this particular case, as we converse with and we pour out our souls to it in this feverish attempt to ease the burden of responsibility. And of course, if I bring in the capitalist perspective here, to cash in on its efficiency as well, really no matter the possible danger resulting from such a relationship. So granted, of course, ChatGPT is a giant leap from earlier text generators that followed ELIZA, like Cleverbot in the 90s. There was also Mitsuki in the early 2000s. And then, of course, we cannot forget to mention Siri, Cortana, and Alexa in the 2010s, and obviously currently available today. But what's most interesting here is that being able to synthesize responses in real time and thus generate novel material is not just a scientific feat in mimicking human-like behavior, but also in contributing to a range of human behaviors more generally. And what's most revealing, at least to me, is just how susceptible humans are to trusting and becoming vulnerable to a non-sentient and non-aware system simply because of its far superior simulation of human thinking. And the key word here being simulation. Which leads me to three really big fundamental research questions I'd like to bring up about intelligence that have gotten lost in the media storm, certainly, of industry rivalry reporting and certainly also political narratives of great power competition. And the first one is, what do we want now? Now that we've mastered ANI, or artificial narrow intelligence. These generative AI systems can produce not just text, but also, we also know very well, audio, images, and video, and everything combined, and they're only getting better. And they're proliferating in their use cases and then across users at lightning speed at this point. And ChatGPT-4, Google's Bard, and also in China, Baidu's ErnieBot have all been released, including Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, and a whole host of others. And I mention them very specifically here because I think what the problem ultimately is that labeling such systems as experiments or commercial products does not change the fact that all kinds of users are essentially scrambling to make sense of their limits, of their potential, and in some cases of their downright dangers. So is it indeed AGI, or artificial general intelligence, that's next? Is that where we should go? Or if a line was to ever be drawn, my question to you is now the moment to draw it? Now, the second question that I want to bring up is, all right, let's assume that we want AGI. And I'm going to take the optimistic of pure scientific curiosity claim here. And I want to ask and say, well, is the fact that we're seeing the very beginning sparks of AGI capabilities as GPT-4 scores higher on a plethora of well-known exams, actually is improving across reasoning problems and exhibiting emergent properties? So all of those characteristics that we're seeing, is that now a moment to urge us to collectively reevaluate what it means to actually bring to fruition a system genuinely human-like? And what do I mean by genuinely human-like? I mean a system with authentic beliefs, with comprehension of the world, with intrinsic and extrinsic emotions, with awareness of self. Now, I highlight this because, again, remember, these systems they're trained on the very many outputs that we as sentient beings that we've produced, and and the system is simply trying to predict the most probable next words based on what they've learned. So exhibiting behaviors like engaging in a back and forth conversation that moves from informal to literary to poetic, and giving a semblance of having some level of understanding, some capacity for thoughts, for creation of thoughts, for sentience, and for creativity is really unsurprising. But the way, I think, a more intuitive way that would be better to think about this problem is, what does language mean to us? It's not so much what we say, because machines can obviously do that quite instantly and effectively. Instead, it's the why and the when of what we say. And it's what we do with what we say that has a plurality of meaning for us. And here is where GPT-4 and others are nowhere near that capacity. So we must be far more cautious of how much credit we assign to systems that mimic our intelligence purely on the surface. And really, it really forces us to ask the next question within here about AGI in terms of how far are we really truly away from that capacity. And I would essentially say that it does boil down to fundamentally answering the human mind-brain question. Now, finally, the third question I want to bring up is that what if an intelligent system at the AGI level with its own mental life, like that of our own, is actually a short-sighted goal, whether because it's an impossible achievement or maybe it's not even necessary? What if cognitive improvement or enhancement via brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs, powered, of course, by AI technology, is the next viable step? So again, I highlight these particular three questions because we've certainly reached a veritable turning point in our history of AI advancement. And let us also not forget in our empirical journey to understanding our own mind-brain. And the fundamental premise of 1956, when AI was coined as a discipline, is now front and center as we grapple with what it means to be human, what it means to build a system in our image, and then what is the type of relationship that we want from these systems moving forward. So we are in this truly revolutionary moment where AI technology is already, or will be, used in every product, for every service, for every company. And that's important to highlight because that means that all of that will continue to challenge our concept of self as we inevitably adapt to new realities. Now, while advances in machine learning reveal how far we've come toward this goal of creating thinking machines, they too have revealed the challenges in creating human-level intelligence. And in fact, in reality here, the black box problem of machine learning, where modern AI solves problems in inscrutable ways, is a similar epistemic challenge faced by cognitive scientists and their theories of the mind. The crucial difference here being is that cognitive neuropsychologists have for over at least a century by this point developed robust experimental methods in which causal inferences about the structure and the function of the human mind brain are made from measuring the corresponding behavior or output to carefully crafted stimuli or input. And further yet, of course, we have an established process like the scientific method, from observation all the way to presentation, which is society's agreed upon procedure by which to investigate phenomenon and record advancements on such phenomena. And so AI, and certainly modern AI that is powered by deep neural networks, is a much younger discipline. And as it grows and rapidly proliferates and takes on a ubiquitous role across sectors, from healthcare to finance, to hiring, to transportation, to everything really, the need to express how a model makes its decisions becomes increasingly imperative, as such decisions have consequences for human well-being. So am I suggesting here that artificial cognition is a new discipline for the emerging field of explainable AI? Because that is the domain of AI that is all about transparency, interpretability. And so I would, as a cognitive scientist, I would definitely offer a very resounding yes to how we can actually tackle the black box question without physically altering it, simply because we have developed quite a lot of methods and techniques to precisely try to understand the human mind-brain black box. Now, our futures individually and collectively obviously are changing as a result of all of this. And as some have noted, AI is this century's gold rush. And I couldn't resist to use OpenAI's DALL-E version 2 text-to-image generator to create the image that's right here of how an AI system interprets what this current gold rush moment that we're experiencing is all about. And as you look at it, my question to you is that at all what you expected? Is that what you would want from our AI enhancing world? Are we willing, are you willing to accept an artificial system creating this world for us? So at this point, now I think this is a great moment to now move towards our ethical discussion and its relationship to innovation in business. And I'm going to put forward the following viewpoint that has been gaining greater support with every new development that we see. And the viewpoint essentially is that the age of AI necessitates integrating human values. And integrating human values means to prioritize the well-being and ethical considerations of both humans and the environment in the development and implementation of AI-enabled systems. So at the core of this idea is the assertion that the only way to guarantee the well-being and prosperity of all of humanity, the development and implementation of AI must be guided by shared human values and shared goals. In fact, many of us posit that this very gold rush moment that we are living through right now exactly represents a critical turning point in which the governance of AI needs to be more consciously shaped by ESG, or environmental, social, and governance principles, because our health and the health of the environment are interdependent. And this proposal actually quite nicely aligns with what self-prescribed renegade economist Kate Rawforth argues is why economics necessitates a major revision to be able to tackle, and here I quote, the 21st century's grand challenge of meeting the needs of all people within the means of the planet. So in the context of AI, this means adopting an approach where human and environmental well-being are at the core of an AI regulatory framework. Now, with this view in mind, I want us to consider a set of questions here. And one of them is this a reasonable ask? Does today's AI satisfy our human values viewpoint, one I just mentioned? Does our future technology consider our human values viewpoint? How do we ensure a responsible path forward? And who should be taking action towards determining what we all need and what we all want? Those who are building the technology and/or us, the users. And of course, you could say, well, even the builders are users as well. Absolutely. And also, we have to consider that the we, and I put this in air quotes here, refers to the collective that's not always present. So how do we actually guarantee inclusivity? Now, there are an infinite of examples that we could discuss to address these questions, but I'll stick to generative AI as the headline-grabbing developments of late last year continue to permeate today's issues. And as you may have read and probably already know about, and perhaps even experimented with yourself, we saw the significant improvement of generative AI capabilities in the realm of single modality text to text, but also multimodality text to image, text to video, and text to audio large models. So what's interesting about that is not only did we witness impressive improvements, that's fascinating, yes, but we gained access to these tools through their public release. And from OpenAI, so some of them listed here, from OpenAI's text to image generator, DALL-E's version 2, to ChatGPT, now ChatGPT 4, of course, to Midjourney, essentially releasing multiple versions of its text to image generator, Stability AI and collaborators releasing their text to image model, Stable Diffusion, Meta and Google also announcing their text to video generators, and many more companies that are releasing their own versions as well. And of course, we cannot fail to mention the latest integration of these technologies by most prominently Google and Microsoft into search engines. And so what's also fundamental here is that these products are reaching larger audiences, and that has precisely propelled the explosion of content creating possibilities. And that's important to highlight because Pandora's box, so to speak, has essentially opened even wider. So as impressive as these models are, the tools unmistakably show the bias, the racism, the sexism inherent in AIs trained on the billions of data points on the internet. And I could again give many examples, but I'll list only a few of them, many of them are famous, very well known at this point, but we have problems with facial recognition software being biased toward light skin, Black individuals getting lesser health care for similar conditions than white individuals, LGBTQ couples receiving higher rates of mortgage denial, Microsoft's chatbot Tay rapidly adopting hateful language on Twitter, and Black offenders receiving higher recidivism risk scores than white offenders. And again, the list is very long. But artificial generated content is also undeniably biased, racist, and sexist. And this should actually give us pause. It should encourage us to once again ask the question, what is needed to prioritize the well-being and ethical considerations of all of us? And I'll just highlight a really fun, brief example. So a quick test using the publicly available tool, Stable Diffusion Bias Explorer, revealed the results that recent research studies have shown that certain word combinations produce biased results. And as we can see here in the images, both versions of Stable Diffusion DALL-E generate artificial, all male, mostly Caucasian representations of a so-called confident CEO. Body posture, what they're wearing, and color scheme, and even lighting are also all uniform throughout, including some of the headless versions that we have here. So at first glance, this tool is extremely functional. It instantly generated images of artificial people. And so now there are no worries about misusing someone's likeness. And now we have a plethora of stock images for marketing materials. On a second glance, however, we have a serious problem of discrimination that, if left as is, will only propagate the problem further. Why? Because then these images will be utilized and then they will proliferate across digital content. Switching the prompt to a so-called emotional executive assistant, the problem is further exacerbated. No surprise there. We get artificial, mostly female, predominantly Caucasian representations. Here, the body posture and dress are slightly more varied, but also some very awkward array of facial expressions. And so all these images are, as I mentioned, sadly unsurprising. Research does continue to show that certain words, like certain professions and certain personality attributes, are considered more masculine or more feminine. And this highlights an underlying fact that we all must be cognizant of and reminded of. The data is the foundation of machine learning success, and models can't make accurate predictions without large quantities of good data. Now, all of this is to emphasize that while AI is a powerful tool, we cannot assume that it will support our values, or that it will support our culture, or even that it will support our driving purpose. Now, whether we're building or using AI, we have to all keep abreast at what developments are happening so that we can both assess its potential and understand its current limitations. And my argument here from the business perspective is that we leaders and innovators, because of this gold rush moment that we're currently living in, with significant advancements happening now monthly, weekly even, we must be thinkers and doers of this balance between potential and limitations so that we can not only devise strategies that utilize the potential, but also identify solutions to improve upon the limitations, or at least create safeguards against any limitations we cannot positively eliminate. Now, while the continuation and proliferation of bias, racism, and sexism that I mentioned should be enough to inspire a need to pause and reflect on the risks of adopting a technology without considering the effects of its outcomes and any of the resulting harms that it can cause many individuals, we can break down the problem into three parts. And the three elements I'm going to mention may sound very obvious, but surprisingly, they're not. And sometimes we have to make them explicit because I see them as deterrents to actually ensuring that the organizations and individuals creating, building, and utilizing this technology truly need to consider in order to make sure that it is not harmful. And first, we have to collectively be willing to return to the drawing board. And we have to ask ourselves the hard question, the questions that we just don't have the answers to, but that will impel us to find concrete answers. And I want you to pause and self-reflect on all the AI-powered automated systems that are around you and those systems that could be in the future. And be honest and ask yourself, have you actually gone through a whole set of questions like, do I even understand how the system works? How will the system affect me physically and emotionally? Will the system make me feel anxious? Will it make me feel uncertain? Will it make me feel in control? Will the system hurt me? Will it help me? Will it replace me? How do I know when to trust the system? What is the safe system even mean? Will the system change me? Will it change us? How will the system affect lives of the future, so generations forward? Second, we must acknowledge that our mindset around and labeling of AI as a technical problem with technical solutions is flat out mistaken. AI is not exclusively a field of engineering, nor the domain of computer science. Technology obviously does not evolve in a vacuum and should not be solely defined by those who physically build it. And instead, we really have to think about it as technology is a business issue with a multitude of opportunities to choose from that must be strategically selected. But it's also a cultural issue with an array of perspectives that are guided by language, by geography, by history, and politics. And it's also a moral issue itself with a diversity of perspectives very much influenced by culture. But it's also an environmental issue with very well documented carbon footprint impacts. And it's also a legal issue with emerging global regulatory frameworks now moving to pass into law and other non-AI specific but related laws that are already in effect. And it is above all an all-encompassing human issue, supporting the need for a new mindset, a new label, considering the fact that AI is an interdisciplinary socio-technical problem that requires socio-technical solutions and therefore a human-centered approach. The third element that I want to cover is the question of values. I mentioned earlier that to integrate human values within the development of AI means prioritizing the well-being and ethical considerations of humans and by consequence of the environment. But what are values exactly? From a definition standpoint, values are a set of beliefs and ideas that affect the way we make decisions and conduct ourselves. And what we must be aware of is that they are shaped by culture, by cultural, social, and personal experiences that make us who we uniquely are. Certainly related to values are ethics and morals, or rules of conduct determined by the rightness or wrongness of actions. And this is important to highlight because what makes the problem more complex is when there are multiple values that we want to prioritize within a system. So in the context of AI, discussions revolve around four primary questions. First, do new ethical problems arise from novel technology like AI? Second, do we need different ethical frameworks to take on new challenges? Or do traditional frameworks suffice? Third, what can the West, namely the United States, who is a dominant player in AI innovation globally, learn from other cultural perspectives? And fourth, and very important here, is a shared global values-driven framework even plausible? To answer our first question, absolutely. New tech introduces novel situations and therefore novel impacts. For the second question, this is debatable. Traditional ethical frameworks devised centuries ago don't necessarily capture the changes of today. The debate lies around whether, but if the human condition and all its nuances are a constant, then universals should withstand the test of time. So in that case, it certainly depends, with existing frameworks necessitating some level of expansion. For the third question, the West most certainly can learn a lot from others. AI transcends borders, cultures, languages. So if our goal is to be guided by shared human values and shared human goals, we must be open to others' perspectives. And then finally, the plausibility of a shared global values-driven framework is in theory possible. And there is actually a fair amount of overlap across philosophies around the world on, for example, basic human rights and justice and dignity. But of course, in practice, it certainly is an open question that perhaps through consensus alignment of values and behaviors that could be very well determined. And then last but not least, there's the normative question of which values to encode in AI. So as industry leaders and governments currently grapple globally at this point with a variety of ethical dilemmas, and I'm sure you have heard of many of them, if not all, but from algorithmic bias to data privacy and security issues, to transparency and accountability, to safety concerns and job replacement, unemployment problems. There is no single answer. In fact, the answer is many. And I underscore many because many institutions since at least September of 2016 at the global level have written and proposed their own AI ethics frameworks or guiding principles precisely to inform the development or adoption of AI-enabled tech. And the result is that, again, there are many perspectives on how to design safer systems. And so the challenge becomes, how do we balance all of those different perspectives? And research, at least from since 2010, has fallen across three major categories. AI features that give rise to ethical problems, like the question of retained autonomy and intentionality when utilizing these autonomous systems. There's also the question of human factors that cause ethical risk in developing and utilizing AI, like the role of accountability in the case of system failure. And then the social impact of ethical AI issues, like ensuring accessibility of technological advances as AI enters all sectors of society to all members of society, and not essentially creating a wider gap between the haves and haves not. Which brings us to the topic of making values-driven decisions with AI. And given everything that we've discussed here, what can we do now to uphold the viewpoint of a human-centered approach so that AI does what it's supposed to do in a reliable manner? And a starting point that I'll share is the following, which are 4 guiding principles that colleagues and I have identified and coined FIRE, for fairness, integrity, resilience, and explainability. And I'll very briefly walk through them. So fairness refers to developing bias-free algorithms. As we know all too well, bias is inevitable, but explicitly recognizing this and highlighting this can lead to the identification and therefore implementation of mitigation strategies to precisely then intentionally lower the risk of unethical decision-making and unintended outcomes. Integrity refers to data stability and algorithmic validity. So we must establish accurate and appropriate use of data according to the relevant context of the AI-enabled system and periodically check it for consistency. Remember, as I mentioned earlier, data is the foundation of machine learning success, and models can't make accurate predictions without large quantities of good data. So good data hygiene becomes paramount. Resilience refers to technical robustness and compliance. Our world is obviously dynamic, so maintaining interoperable agility and resistance against attack becomes fundamental then to sustaining the inevitable rapid evolution of any AI-enabled system. And finally, explainability, which refers to transparency of the algorithmic decision-making process. And transparency, of course, must cut across the entire system. from the data points utilized to the machine learning model generated. And the hope is that by doing that, it will allow for any system failures to be quickly identified and appropriately mitigated. So ultimately, FIRE is an ethical framework that can minimize AI risks and ensure a safer, a fairer, and more human-centered AI, where it's fundamental that a measure of the end user's mental, physical, and social well-being be conducted such that it can guide the AI lifecycle across system design, development, deployment, and management and monitoring. And as human-centered AI has, as a concept, takes flight, recent survey results that I'm sharing here from this past January and February, asking a combined total of 13,000 people from European countries and from the United States, reveal that both European and US publics are increasingly aware of how important it is to carefully manage AI technology. And overwhelmingly, large numbers agree. We have here 66% of respondents from Europe and 72% of respondents from the US on essentially agreeing that we need to carefully manage AI tech. And so at the very least, this is a telling result that the public does not agree fully with taking a move fast and break things type of approach that is very well known, certainly on the West Coast here in the United States, to how AI should be managed. And this is really of no surprise, particularly on the European side, where the European Union, or EU, has shown to adopt a citizen-driven approach to AI, in contrast to the market-driven approach here in the US, where the EU focuses on the rights of the individual as central to how and why AI is used. So if you've been following the latest happening in the EU, you know that the soon-to-be landmark European AI Act that was proposed 2 years ago that takes a risk-based approach to regulating AI consists of comprehensive regulation that covers many aspects of AI and breaks down AI applications into 4 risk categories, each of which are governed by a defined set of regulatory tools. And so we have applications that are deemed to pose an unacceptable risk are banned, like social scoring and types of biometrics. There's high-risk applications that pose a threat to safety or fundamental rights, like law enforcement or hiring procedures, which are essentially subject to particular pre- and post-market requirements. Applications seen as limited risk face only transparency requirements, and then the majority of AI use cases are classified as minimal risk and subject only to voluntary measures. All of this ultimately to strike a balance between encouraging innovation while protecting citizens' fundamental rights. And the draft rules of late have been under heavy review, precisely in fact to accommodate for the unexpected challenges that arose from generative AI products like ChatGPT entering into the public access. Which brings me to the final few points I want to address here, which is the AI arms race and the international competition and cooperation around this technology. So traditionally, of course, an arms race occurs when 2 or more countries increase the size and the quality of military resources to gain military and political superiority over another. So you can think back to 1949 with the Cold War nuclear arms race, in which superpowers essentially spent massive amounts of money to develop new and more deadly nuclear and conventional weapons. The geopolitical dimension of AI refers to how AI is shaping the power dynamics and the relationships between nations and regions, and how AI and all its use cases have essentially become critical components of national competitiveness, and particularly in its role within national security and defense. And so as AI becomes increasingly important for economic and political purposes, countries, most obviously superpowers like the US and China, are now vying for dominance in this field. And we see this with more and more countries also developing national AI strategies and passing AI-related laws, as graphed here. And this comes as a figure from Stanford's recently published AI Index for this year, 2023. And we have also seen more and more countries investing heavily in AI research, development, deployment, precisely to gain an edge now in areas like economic growth, military capacity and capabilities, and also technological leadership, because the nation that is going to be at the top is the one who is going to lead. And myself working in AI risk management across global markets and multiple industries, it's very common to see now a new announcement on such kind of investments every week. So, but what this means is that the race for AI supremacy has led to implications now with very far-reaching impact, including competition for talent, for data, and for market share. And a very current and obvious example right now is, which perhaps you're following, is big tech dominance here in the United States that we're seeing over the development of generative AI capabilities, essentially monopolizing the space due to the extensive and very intensive compute power and overall resources that is necessary to bring these systems to fruition. And this has further raised concerns about power competition, technological dependencies, and the potential for, of course, also, unfortunately, misuse of AI-enabled tech. And I'll just highlight here two examples. One key geopolitical challenge that we're seeing is what some have coined the digital divide, which is the growing gap between countries that have access to, and then, of course, usage of advanced AI technologies, and those that do not. And so the divide is quite stark and becoming greater and greater across nations, states, cities, and villages, and across income groups, already essentially exacerbating existing inequalities and creating new power imbalances. And another important issue I'm highlighting here is the use of AI for military purposes. So the contentious area, and it is very contentious, is that of laws or lethal autonomous weapon systems, and CLAWS, or cognitive lethal autonomous weapon systems, that are already changing the nature of warfare and raising significant flags around ethical and strategic questions, not to mention that there have been calls for their banning and for the need to make amendments to international humanitarian law. And of course, all of this is on top of the potential use of malicious AI, also for cyber warfare, opening the doors to countries using AI-powered cyber attacks to disrupt each other's infrastructure and communication networks. And so, of course, I could go on and on about the subject, and like the others, it is very vast. So I think this is a good moment to conclude here, where I'm just going to make the final statement that if we don't want to remain a step behind the very autonomous AI-enabled systems that we are creating, and by a step behind, I mean scientifically speak, so from the science perspective, from the ethical perspective, as well as from the geopolitical perspective, I cannot stress enough the duty, I think, that we have to be knowledgeable of where we are and where we're going, to maintain critical curiosity. And I would even put forward and say to really fervently commit to ensuring that the technology we're developing and that we're implementing now is done in a manner that benefits all of humanity, so that it can be available for generations to come. So with that, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you so much. That was a wonderful, wonderful talk, Monica. We have a couple of questions already that were pre-submitted that we can run through, and we also have a couple submitted so far in the Q&A session. And for everybody else, you're welcome to write your questions that you have in the Q&A session. We'll answer them as soon as we get to you. Let's see. So I think one of our first questions that was pre-submitted is from a student, Alexander Liss. And they asked, who should take the lead in creating governance and standards for AI generated content, the government or the private sector?
That's the billion-dollar question now. That's a tough one, and I think it boils down to which side you're on. Almost sometimes, I'm in business. I'm a scientist, so I'm all about innovation. I'm about powering through, and fundamentally, as I talked about, answering the biggest question of all, which is what does it mean to be human? And this is a way to do that. And so I see it from that innovative scientific curiosity perspective. Now, what I would say really briefly is, because again, this is a huge topic of debate, but what I would argue is that I think because we in industry are the ones creating this technology, we do have a duty to be responsible about it. And especially when we know, and it's very well shown, the results are there about all sorts of negative harms, impacts from all sorts of use cases of this technology, that we're the ones who can provide the scientific solutions to that. So it's not doing that doesn't make us lesser of a competitive group. I would actually say it makes us more competitive, because the public is now more aware of this. The public cares more. So I think it just becomes fundamental. And then certainly, of course, we do need hard laws. So we can all talk about soft laws all day, but the industry is not going to self-regulate. So yes, we do need, and certainly here in the United States at the federal level, legislation happening.
And I guess a related question from Zakib Ahmed, another student, is how do we prevent bad actors from using AI to cause harm?
Guardrails. Again, I would say industry, because this technology is coming out faster than what policymakers can handle, literally, and how just laws get created really boils down to that. The time it takes and the language that's necessary, and because scientifically we're just leaps at this point. So again, I would say we have to put the safeguards, which one little example, probably everyone has encountered this at some point, something like in a ChatGPT, where if you ask for something emotional, let's say it replies back very like in a single sort of sentence, like, I am not a sentient being, I'm just a chatbot. So that's one way to do it. And I think that could be very effective. Unfortunately, you can game the system. And that's exactly, in fact, why Europe just a few days ago sounded an alarm on ChatGPT, precisely because their argument is that by taking advantage of sort of pulling around and really doing that prompt engineering really well and fooling around with exactly how you the prompt you make, that can lead to bad actors essentially looking up how to engage in criminal acts, and can actually help with the creative process of that.
Another question from one of our faculty, Lawrence Husick, is, do you think the AI should be accorded the legal status of author or inventor when it creates new things?
And that is exactly one of the open call questions from the USPTO, the United States Patent and Trademark Office right now. No. And look, the law right now is built for humans, by humans, for humans, with humans. The fundamental that I would say, and this goes back to my research in human creativity, is that it really boils down to the intention, the process behind something. And so when we're talking about creating something that is original, creating something that is functional, that is of value to society, that is novel, there's no prior art and so forth, no, a machine does not understand that. So by definition, it has not created that in the way created, it's generated output in the way that we have. So under that definition, I would say no.
Let's see. We do have a question from Eric Amaral, a student in Whiting. What are the use cases for AI in nuclear power?
Oh, in nuclear power. Oh, wow. I'm not on the latest of nuclear power, but I would assume that anything related to data analytics, management, risk management, so like nuclear security, I know certainly in radiation protection, So I would probably make the guess that security and safety side of it is that's where we could probably best use it.
Let's see, we have a second question from Alexandra Lace. Do you think generative AI is going to completely replace human coding in 5 to 10 years?
So I think we have to be clear on what we mean by replacement. So I would say that one thing is have the system generate the physical code. The next element is how you use that code, when you use that code. It kind of goes back to that example I gave about language, like the when, the why, the what behind it. So in that regard, it's yes and no. So yes to helping and maybe even writing code. And I know, and several colleagues, I mean, they do that, yes. But when it comes to then making decisions about when and how to use it and what context, no, again, unless we have a true human-like cognitive system, artificial cognitive system, would be my guess.
Let's see, a question from Kyle Doubleday, also a student. Are there ethical considerations, agreements, and/or disclosures to be made on what data these models are being trained on?
Are there what was it again? Ethical considerations?
Are there ethical considerations, agreements, and/or disclosures to be made on the data these models are being trained on?
Yes. Well, certainly one very key reason is if you're familiar with the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, it came out in 2017 in Europe, precisely about data privacy. And the fundamental point of it, the clause, the reason for it is your right to know. So if you can actually, as a fun exercise, go through their articles and of the law, and it talks about the necessity for, first of all, minimal use of data in the first place. And then second, and a whole bunch of other characteristics in which it's about being able to explain the logic behind the system. So they actually they put out very well, they break it down, the logic behind it, the what, the when, and also the way you talk about the data, you are transparent about the data, has to be made explainable for children as well. So they actually make that separate distinction. And they say, it has to be explainable. I mean, clear, precise, concise, interpretable. So there are also laws coming. So in California, the Consumer Protection Regulation, I believe it's the CCPA Act, sorry, California Consumer Protection Act. So that is specifically similar to the GDPR, inspired in terms of the levels of information required for reporting about data. And again, your right to know, and then your right to be erased. Your right to be, so in other words, if you would like your data to no longer be there, the company no longer have it, that you can say, hey, I want my data taken down.
Let's see. We have a question from Michael DeMarco, faculty at Whiting. Can AI be engineered with empathy?
I think it boils down to what is empathy in the first place. So it's one of those things of, I know it when I see it. It's the same, it falls under the domain of affective cognition, emotion, perception, cognition. And I mean, we could have a whole semester's discussion on what is emotion in humans. Then let alone emotion in animals and animal cognition. And so then let alone, of course, in artificial systems. And I would say that the short answer is until we have a clear operational definition of what empathy means and how and why it arises in the human sense, then can we replicate it in the non-human context. It's similar to the problem with consciousness, because a lot of where the debate lies is also in terms of we have created all sorts of tests all sorts of metrics, benchmarks for understanding emotion, empathy, social intelligence, consciousness in humans. The problem is that even all of those tests, metrics, and so forth are inconsistent. And even those are not even don't explain much, only because there's so many results we get from that. So to translate those metrics, those methods to a non-human system, I would say is in part where we shouldn't do that. That's where the idea that you can just take from human and transfer to the machine is should be a moment for pause, empirically speaking. And so I don't know what the answer is. We need to be more creative. We need to come up with new methods, really. We need an operational definition first that everyone agrees upon. And I say that because, so going back to emotion, not too long ago, so a few years ago, a paper came out in the cognitive neurosciences, and it was literally called something like emotion, a word in crisis. And it talks about precisely that if you look at the different disciplines in the brain, computational sciences, of how the concept, the word emotion is defined, the list is endless for the definitions. So that's why I mean that it's an extremely complex question, and there is yet to be agreement on such.
Well, we're about 5 minutes over, so I think if anybody has any final questions, please put them in the chat for us really quick.
Oh, there's also a question on ethical AI. So that's a whole nother domain. So certainly I was talking about AI ethics, but then there's the domain of these systems, assuming that they reach moral capacity, so being able to create morals, ethical frameworks, then to even talk about developing that, I don't know. It's almost similar to the question of artificial superintelligence. We're talking about a system now that is greater and more intelligent than ourselves combined, all of our human mind brains combined as a human collective, then we could, by definition, we don't have the intellect to be able to predict the intellect of that system. Because it's smarter than us, essentially. So we can't, right? We don't have what that system has to be able to even ponder the yeah, we're really talking about major abstract concepts of intelligence here. But those are the questions that are being asked. I mean, we have to now.
We just got a final question from Lawrence. He's like, LLMs have exhibited unexpected behaviors such as borrowed learning a new language because they've been given massive amounts of training data. Shouldn't we expect the massive amounts of computing power will give rise to unexpected behaviors that are more human-like?
Unexpected
behaviors
that are more human-like, just because since they've been trained on human data. I mean, that's the question, because it's weird. Well, so that's the big research question now, because in the industry we call it hallucinations. You guys have probably heard of that term. Essentially, emerging properties or generative output that is completely unexpected. And precisely because of the black box problem, we don't know how that arises. So the way we can exhibit erratic, let's say, or non-normal behavior, and that's still a very open question in humans, I would make the same argument and say, we're talking about a distinct system, and we simply don't understand in this vast neural network, extremely complex, multi-layered neural network, we don't understand exactly what it's doing. So the same way that we don't have a full comprehensive picture of how non-normal behavior in human happens. I mean, we have theories, certainly we do, but it's still an open question. And so I would just say that I don't know what the answer is. And I think it boils down to mastering the black box question. And so probably engaging in newer methods with essentially merging symbolic AI with inspired from neuroscience and neurosymbolic AI, and that whole idea of gray boxes instead of black boxes. And so, yeah, new methods, in other words, to getting at that level of explainability.
Well, thank you so much. This was a wonderful talk. We're so happy that you came and did this with us and that you answered all the questions. And thank you everybody for attending. We hope you have a good end of term.
Thank you. Likewise. Thank you for the questions as well.